everybody. Today we're going to be discussing fermentation. This is a really critical element in what we're going to be doing in the course. And I really encourage you to dive in on this stuff, do the reading that we're going to be covering today, come to class with questions. We'll have a lot of good stuff going on here. We're just going to start right off and dive into your text. So follow along with me as we start with question number 1 in chapter 1 of volume 2. All right. And it starts off with the really straightforward question of what is fermentation? Your text says alcoholic fermentation is the process of breaking down sugars into ethanol, carbon dioxide, and energy. You can think of energy as heat, all right, because fermentation kicks off heat. The purpose of brewery fermentation is to produce a flavorful and moderately alcoholic beverage from relatively unpalatable wort. We drank wort in class. You know what that's like. We made wort out of base malt, out of some specialty malts, roasted malt, and caramel malt. You know that on their own, they really are fairly unpalatable. There's things that you can do in the cooking sphere with them and everything like that, but kind of as is, it really doesn't have much going on for itself. It's only after fermentation when we can reduce all of those sugars and allow the balance of the beer to shine. Kind of talking about this concept of fermentation is, like I said before, it's really the heart and soul of not what we're doing, because what we're doing with the brewing process is really creating an environment that's suitable for the yeast to work in and to live in. And they're the hardest working workers in the brewery, the yeast, right? So yeah, it goes on a little bit further. It says sound fermentation procedures produces green beer that has the proper flavor and is free from microbial contamination. It also yields sufficient viable yeast for the next fermentation cycle while leaving a sufficient cell count in the beer for proper conditioning during aging. We're going to be diving into that stuff a little bit more. But as we said in class before, when the yeast is pitched or added to the beer, that's really technically when it becomes beer. And there's a lot of processes that go into it to actually creating the beer that you want to create. And a lot of that boils down to things like having a clean and sanitary vessel, proper yeast health, the right amount of oxygen, and the right amount of yeast going into your fermentation. All right. Just the quick note on question 1, especially that first portion. Alcoholic fermentation is the process of breaking down sugars into ethanol, alcohol, carbon dioxide, and energy, heat. That heat portion is a key one, and it's why we really want to have temperature-controlled fermentation. What can happen is that you can pitch yeast into a wort at 68 degrees, but it can build 10 to 15, sometimes even 20 degrees in the fermenter. And at that temperature, the yeast will be happy to be doing its work, and it'll do it really fast, but it won't give you the beer that you want from most beers that you're going to be making. All right? So we want to be able to temperature control that. In class, we've used what was the name of that thing? The brew jacket, because it's insulated on the inside. There's a temp probe that goes down, and it maintains that internal temperature, and you can tell from that tasty Mosaic beer that it worked out well. We will be revisiting that beer this week in lab. Let's jump up to question number 3, and it says, what differentiates yeast strains? There's a lot of different yeast strains out there. If you were to go to whitelabs.com, I believe that's the website, or Yeast, or any of the other yeast manufacturers out there, the yeast production labs, you're going to find a whole library of yeast that you can use. And yeast can really be seen as one of the ingredients that you use to really drive flavor. If you remember back to the Saison that we made in class, there really wasn't much that went into it other than base malt and a little bit of hops. And all the other character for that beer was really created by the yeast. Sometimes you're going to use the yeast to drive flavor by actually having a flavor forward yeast. And sometimes you're going to use yeast strains that don't produce as much flavor because you want to emphasize other things in the beer, right? About midway through that paragraph under number 3, it says some distinguishing characteristics include fermentation temperature and fermentation period. Lager yeast ferments at a lower temperature, typically in the 41 to 54 degree range, and with a 5 to 12 day fermentation period, although some styles of beer are brewed using lager yeast at close to ale fermentation temperatures. Ale yeast performs best at temperatures in the 59 to 72 degree range, with a fairly rapid 3 to 5 day fermentation period, and tend to produce more esters and higher alcohol. So those esters are those fruity characteristics that you can get in beer, and higher alcohol. I like to talk about it as being boozy, but literally like thinking about sometimes when you smell a beer, you can almost like smell the ethanol or like the vodka in it, right? And that's how I like to describe that. So when we differentiate between ales and lagers, we're going to be looking at where it's primarily a fermentation temperature range that we're talking about, okay? Lagers are going to want to be in the kind of that mid 40s to low 50s range, and ale yeast is going to be in kind of that little bit more room temperature range around 67 to low 70s. Belgian yeast are kind of an outlier in the fact that you can pitch them much warmer. You can pitch them colder. You can add them colder and allow them to ferment colder. But by and large, you can ferment Belgian yeast warmer. And there's some different hybrid yeasts and things like that. When it comes to that, when it comes to choosing a yeast for the beer that you're going to brew, what you want to do is you want to select a yeast that's actually going to be creating the flavor profile that you want for your beer. You can go through the yeast catalog and actually do some shopping and read about it. You can find out how much the yeast will attenuate the sugar that's available, all right, because some yeast will leave a sweeter beer and some yeast will leave a drier beer. You can see what kind of flavors and aromas they generate. So it's cool. It's another one of those awesome little dials that you can turn that really kind of gives you this endless degree of things that you can do with beer. So yeah, just to hone in on that between the difference between ale and lager yeast. Sometimes you're going to hear people say, oh, I like lagers, or I like ales, or I like stouts. They're using those words wrong. Okay. Generally, what they mean is that they had an ale somewhere one time and they liked it. Or if they, quote, don't like ales, they had an ale somewhere before and they didn't like it. But when we say ale or lager, we're really just talking about the type of strain that's being used. All right. And I'd also like to emphasize it says 3 to 5 days. I believe that's what they quoted in the book. 3 to 5 days for fermentation for an ale. And 5 to 12 days for lager. That's really just talking about that initial fermentation phase. And there's usually more time that's needed to potentially clean up any off flavors that has been created during fermentation. When they're talking about fermentation in this light, what they're talking about is actually the reduction of sugar, the consumption of sugar into, and then it's processed into heat, CO2, and alcohol, and also flavor compounds, flavor and aroma compounds. But there's also a cleaning up period that will happen once all the sugar that they can eat has been exhausted. And then what they'll do is they'll actually, in kind of a gross way, they'll kind of go back and reconsume their own byproducts, all right, and actually clean the beer up. 2 of those byproducts, one is diacetyl, and we can touch on these two a little bit right here. Diacetyl and acetaldehyde or acetaldehyde. You'll hear people say it different ways. But just to dive into those a little bit. Diacetyl, both diacetyl and acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is a green apple, like Jolly Rancher. and diacetyl is movie theater butter. Okay? Both of those things can be really big hints that either A, you didn't have enough yeast, they weren't healthy enough, there wasn't the right amount of oxygen in the wort. They can be indicative of some other things too, including potential infection, especially with diacetyl. But yeah, and we'll touch on those more in lab as well. Let's jump over to question number 5. Question number 5 asks, what is wild yeast? And I think this is interesting to see where they're going to go with this one. Question number 5, what is wild yeast? This definition is probably shifting a little bit right now, or it's definitely shifting a little bit right now, because quote unquote wild yeast is becoming more and more prevalent in breweries, both to good ends and to potentially bad ends. You have to be very careful when you're purposefully introducing wild yeast into your brewery, or non-standard beer yeast. So let's take a look at this. There's a couple things that I want to highlight. So immediately under what is wild yeast? It's any strain other than the specific brewery culture yeast. That doesn't sound right. Any strain other than the specific brewery culture yeast is typically referred to as wild yeast. Cross-contamination of strains may occur in breweries utilizing multiple strains for different beer styles. So what they're saying is, if your house yeast, what you ferment most of your product with, is American ale yeast, and you end up using a Hefeweizen strain, a Belgian strain, or something like that, things are all typical ale yeast, that can still be counted as wild yeast for you. All right? If you get a Belgian strain that has gotten into your American strain, you will end up getting a situation where you start producing, where you want to be producing a clean American ale, but you're starting to show more and more Belgian characteristics in it, and that can be very undesirable. It was a little while ago where Revolution Brewing Company in Chicago, great place, makes some really nice beers. Their beers are available here in Michigan now. Their Hero series, that Mosaic IPA, that Mosaic Hero that they do, is a really nice beer. They had an issue where they recalled, I believe, thousands of barrels of beer because I think it was that they had a Belgian strain get in with what they wanted to be their clean ale yeast, and they had to do a massive recall. So it is a real thing. A lot of times when we say wild yeast, we're thinking of non-standard beer yeast, but they're introducing it as this concept of, if you have multiple strains in your brewery that produce very different beers, and they get mixed together, contaminated, even though they're all actually still clean yeast, they can give you characters that you're not looking for. Okay, so I think that's kind of the interesting thing about the way they're defining wild yeast for this. It continues on and says many wild yeast strains are responsible for off flavors, aromas, notably phenolic or plasticky, clove, spicy, hazes, and attenuation problems. Some wild yeast strains are referred to as killer yeast because they excrete toxins that inhibit the growth of culture yeast. And I have a star next to that saying fun fact, so please feel free to denote the fun fact in your text. That's not something that I'll be really looking for in an exam or anything like that. But yeah. Okay, so they're really talking about wild yeast as any strain that you do not explicitly intend to be part of a fermentation. All right? There are many breweries right now that are using strains of bacteria and wild yeast to ferment beer, to make very, very different beers. Sometimes they can be fantastic, and sometimes they can be awful. Most times people don't know the difference, and I'm not being difficult. There's a palate that needs to be developed for sour beer, and sometimes sour beer makers end up producing just something that is so wildly acidic and then the novice taster, or even the not so novice taster, drinks it and thinks that everybody else says it's good, and so it has to be good, when in fact it's just really sour as hell. And I think even in sour beer, there's meant to be balance. So yeah, that's me on my soapbox a little bit. So brewers go to great ends to keep various strains that they keep in-house separate. All right. Let's jump up to number 10, and this is an important one. And so what we're doing is we have our brew day. We already talked about wort production. You get your you're going to be transferring your wort into your fermenter, and then you need to be adding yeast to it. And what that yeast is going to be doing initially is the whole key. All right, and it's this initial phase that's so important. All right, and it's why you want the right amount of yeast. Healthy enough yeast. You can send a million people into battle, but I would rather send 1,000,000 18-year-olds out rather than 1,000,000 90-year-olds. Okay, so it's just not about the number of people you're sending out there, it's how healthy they are as well. With that said, I don't want to send anyone off to war, in case you're fearing that I was some sort of monger. I'm enjoying doing these videos more and more, just so you know. Anyways, I think I was going to say monger today. Question number 10. How do yeast cells multiply? The highlighted portion that I'd like to focus on is the yeast cell multiplies by cell division. A small bud forms on the mother and grows until its size matches that of the parent. When the bud is mature, it typically separates, forming an identical new cell or daughter. In most brewery fermentations, skipping down a little bit, in most brewery fermentations, a doubling of cells typically occurs in 2 to 6 hours. Now, this is really, really key. All right, because this is when the majority of the flavor and aroma in your beer is produced. It is produced at cell multiplication. The flavors and aromas that the fermentation character of your beer is determined early. Okay, there used to be some homebrewer knowledge that said if you really wanted your lager fermentation to take off fast, we already said we need to be fermenting, in the low 50s, high 40s. Well, just start it really warm and then crash it down. That's nonsensical. It's not a thing. Because all the flavor in that lager is going to be produced while you're keeping it warm. All right? And it's going to produce esters and higher alcohols that are inappropriate for a lager. All right? So you're worried about temperature control. Because especially at this point, they're starting to produce heat. They want the volume of liquid to heat up, all right? And yeah, you want to suppress that temperature, all right? You want to give them a good controlled environment to grow in, all right? There's a few different things, that budding that the yeast do in multiplication. This is really important. We're going to talk about some different things, like for instance, we're adding oxygen for multiple reasons, but for one reason, is when a wort is appropriately aerated, that cell has the ability to bud, and then that scar that's formed between the mother and the daughter. Why can't it be the father and the son? I'm teasing. That scar where it separates can be a spot that will not, it can get tough, or it can get, the right word isn't brittle, but the more you can diminish that scarring, the more those yeast cells can continue to reproduce. All right. The more stress you put on them, the more weird flavors they're going to be kicking off. So that oxygen actually helps in the pliability of the cell wall. All right. So it doesn't scar up, and it can multiply again and again. It's a really big thing. All right. We are jumping on up to number 13, and I always feel a little bad because I would like to be asking if there's any questions, because we're talking about some very important stuff, and we're going to spend some more time in it on this stuff in lab on Thursday. So Anyways, we will come back to it, but I want you to have some of this knowledge coming into class. On question 13, it says, what is the yeast life cycle curve? All right. And you're going to want to work on this one a lot because it's really important. I think it's important. Okay. Meaning that I'm going to grade it importantly on your final. All right. This is a big one. This will help you talk to brewers and let them know that they kind of know what they're talking about. This is this is a money earner. All right. You can go in to run a place and actually have an intelligent conversation with your brewer about what's going on. And that'll be a thumbs up. So question 13, what is the yeast life cycle curve? Starts off, during fermentation, yeast cells follow a life cycle that can be divided into 5 phases, and you need them all. So get ready to start writing, underlining, highlighting, and or all of the above. The lag phase, the growth phase, the stationary phase, flocculation, and finally, dormancy. Let's jump through these some. The lag phase commences when the yeast is pitched into aerated wort. Yeast metabolism is slow at first as the cells prepare enzyme systems necessary for growth. The yeast absorbs wort oxygen to bank as a raw material for cell membrane production during the growth phase. I just said that. The lag phase can last from 6 to 20 hours, depending on yeast health, pitch rate, and wort temperature. If your yeast says to ferment it at 67 degrees, I like to start it off at 65 to 66. Okay? Starting a couple degrees below gives you a little bit of a buffer. It lets it come up to that range. It's not shocking for the yeast, and you get a nice clean fermentation out of it. And to switch to the screensaver, I didn't know we actually had a screensaver on this. During the growth phase, the yeast utilizes simple wort nutrients such as sugars, amino acids, vitamins, and minerals. That's why many times at the end of a fermentation, both at home and in professional breweries, you'll see the addition of yeast nutrient to the end of the boil to kind of give the yeast, it's almost, I've heard it explained more that it's not for the fermentation as much that you're doing in that beer, but it's for them to be stronger for the next time you use them. So in the professional brewing setting, we're constantly maintaining a yeast culture. So kind of steadfastly dumping that yeast nutrient into the kettle is providing them, it's like a long-term development of the yeast strain. If you're doing it at home, you don't necessarily have to use yeast nutrient, but I think it's a good idea. Most time at home, I was brewing with liquid yeast, and I would make a starter to help grow it up a little bit, and then I would add that starter to the beer. All right, so I'd build up the vitality of my yeast, the number of yeast cells, get them raging and ready to go. Okay, so I'd add nutrient definitely to there to kind of give them a boost as well, and I added in the kettle too because I could. All right, even though I did not do a lot of yeast harvesting at home. One thing I want to jump over to the next page on page 7, and I really want to highlight this. Healthy yeast growth, therefore, is the key to proper fermentation, along with sanitation and all the other things we've been mentioning. That's one of the really huge keys. As the usable nutrients are depleted and toxic compounds such as alcohol and carbon dioxide build up, yes, those two items are toxic to yeast. They are as a waste. The yeast prepares for life in a hostile environment. That sounds very dramatic. During the stationary phase, the yeast utilizes storage compounds such as glycogen, which will be consumed to sustain its life during dormancy. The yeast flocculates and is harvested from the fermenter. If the yeast is not harvested promptly, it begins to die and releases enzymes and other cell materials to the detriment of beer quality. The last process, that breakdown of yeast, is called autolysis. They can say that it is brothy, meaty, like rubber tire. Okay, all super desirable things. So when you can get when your beer is actually finished, get it off the yeast. I think autolysis can be a little bit overplayed. I think if you have a lot of healthy yeast and you are in good shape to start, I don't think your beer is going to go from good one day to bad the next. All right. Um, I've had beer in fermenters for longer than I wanted to with yeast on them, and it's okay. What you will notice is sometimes the pH will start to creep up, and that can be one of the indicators that you have autolysis going on and you need to get that beer off the yeast. Right? Okay, so we're going to jump forward up to question 30. 30. Why is oxygen needed in cold wort? Yeast uses oxygen dissolved in wort to synthesize unsaturated fatty acids and sterols, which are essential for cell membrane development. We're hitting this point multiple times because it's an important one. A sufficient amount of dissolved oxygen, or DO, ensures high yeast growth, a quick start of fermentation, and good maturation. Brewer's yeast growing in wort does not use oxygen for respiration. All right. Jumping on to 31, as we've covered that pretty well. When should wort be aerated? Most brewers add air or oxygen, preferably oxygen, especially like a legit clean source. Medical grade oxygen is great. To wort as it exits the wort cooler. Okay, so as you're passing through the heat exchanger, like in a professional brewery, it's going in close to boiling and coming out at room temperature, roughly. Once fermentation starts, ideally, no further air or oxygen should be added. Some brewers, and this is kind of a caveat, this is an interesting one. Some brewers may need to rouse or add air to high gravity or high alcohol beers with some ales during fermentation, but this practice may lead to problems with flavor stability. The problem is once yeast grow and they start eating sugar, all right, if you hit it with a solid amount of O2, you run the risk of start oxidizing that beer, okay? You're infusing oxygen. If the yeast does not consume it all, it will still be in there and it will start limiting your shelf life and the freshness of your beer, all right? And you'll slowly start trending toward papery cardboard kind of stuff. So yes. Question number 33. How much oxygen is needed for proper fermentation? You'll see a lot of people do this a lot of different ways. The oxygen requirement for different yeast strains varies. However, typical yeast requires a DO, or dissolved oxygen content, of at least 5 parts per million, and the best results are achieved with 8 to 10 parts per million in standard worts, depending on what yeast strain you're using. It's also yeast strain dependent. You can kick killer questions to the people at White Lab, somebody like Neva Parker, who is a yeast boss. And they can answer some of these really technical questions as to what yeast actually needs more or less oxygen. Therefore, a rule of thumb for high gravity or high density or inevitably high alcohol worts is 1 ppm per degree Plato, and we can talk about that a little bit more in class about Plato. It's just a different way to measure density. Therefore, high gravity worts require a DO level well above the air saturation level, which is no more than 10 ppm in wort. Right? A lot of time that O2 is going to be injected immediately after the wort is coming out of the heat exchanger. You're going to be using a stainless steel stone. If you end up thinking about like an aquarium pump, and that little, sand kind of stone that they have sticking off the end of it, it's the exact same thing except it's stainless steel. Okay, you can clean it and sanitize it and heat it up, and it doesn't break down. And it's injecting really fine bubbles into the wort. One of the interesting things that I learned about this is you do get oxygen pickup from those bubbles traveling along with the wort to the fermenter. But when you think about a tank, like an aquarium, where you're not actually picking up a ton of O2 from the bubbles that are coming up through the water. What you're actually doing is you're actually turning over the surface of the water. And that entire surface of the water is exposed to the air. And so as you turn that over and it creates that rousing on top of the water, you're exposing it to more oxygen in the air, and that's where it's taken up, the majority of it, right? And so it's the same thing with beer. You're also going to get a considerable amount of pickup from the oxygen that you build up in the headspace of the fermenter and that churning motion as you're filling the fermenter. All right? That is fermentation in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to be diving more into this and be working with these concepts in the lab on Thursday. Just a quick note, things went well with the midterm by and large. I'm realizing I can't use this lecture next year now because maybe they won't do well on the midterm. But things went well there. Please check your grades online. Get any assignments that you have not done into me to still salvage some credit with it. And please make sure that you have volume 2 with you when you show up in lab and be ready to kill it with me. All right? Hope you have a great night. Bye. It's the first time I said bye at the end of one of these.